All right, everyone, welcome back to the Ultimate Mixdown. I'm tracking a new song. I don't have any fancy amplifiers in my studio, and I don't want to put in the money to go to a studio, pay to rent the equipment, pay for the studio time, have somebody else dial in those sounds when I know that I can get relatively close in the box and still have a really good sounding tone. And on top of that, I decided to work through and dial it in with free plugins and free IRs and emulations, and we'll talk to what those are in a little bit. So that all you need to do is have a DAW, digital audio workstation, and you can put these plugins on your plugin chain for your metal guitars or your electric guitars, and you should be able to achieve similar, if not the same results. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive right into it. I'm going to show you my chain, and we have, what do we have here? We have Overdrive, right? We're going to start with Overdrive. Then we'll put on a tube amplifier, and there's a number of plugins, a number of free plugins for that. Then we'll put on a power amp for additional leveling if you need to, but most likely I'm just going to use this for the saturation because it adds additional warmth and tones and harmonics that will add to the sound in a pleasant way that I appreciate. And then we're going to add our cabinet IRs. So those are impulse responses, and we'll talk to that again when we go to add those. And then a little bit of EQ. All right, so if you're recording distorted guitars and you're going through a plugin chain where the plugins aren't creating this crazy volatility in the source signal that you're sending it to, you're not really going to need compression, okay? Because these are distorted electric guitars, right? But that might be something to keep in the back of your mind in case you do have those kind of conflicts in the future. And then we can talk to what happens after you dial in that guitar tone in terms of having multiple guitars, you know, EQing multiple guitars at once, and then adding effects like reverb and delay. But those are kind of like the special sauce on top of the secret sauce. So I'm going to click on my effects chain, right? So FX, and we're going to just see right here what we have going on, right? And I have two different types of EQs at the end, and we'll talk to both of those. To kick it off, let me open this window. It's not going to expand. All right, but let's take a look. The very first thing that I put on is an Overdrive plugin. All right, this is a TS999. There's also the TSE808 that a lot of people have used in the past. This is basically emulating a pedal, a guitar pedal for overdrive tones. It's not adding a crazy amount of distortion, but it's adding a little bit of warmth to the signal, and you can dial that in. You can add a little extra drive, but I wouldn't go too high because it starts to sound artificial, especially in the higher frequencies. And then you can dial in the tone. What I've specifically seen with a lot of people that use this specific plugin is they kind of keep the tone at noon. They keep the drive relatively low, just dialing it up just a little bit because a little bit goes a long way with this plugin. All right, and then you keep the level at noon. It doesn't really alter the effect. It doesn't really alter the volume of the signal that's going in. Okay, so that's Overdrive. So let me take all these off. All of these plugins are going to uncheck, and then I'm going to record enable this right here. You should be able to hear the sound of the guitars, but it's going to sound basically very basic because I'm just doing a direct in through my audio interface. Let me talk about that chain real quick. I have my electric guitar. I have a 1/4-inch cable going to my audio interface, my Focusrite Scarlett 2i2. And then I have that plugged into my computer via USB. Okay, and then Reaper is seeing the Focusrite 2i2 and taking that as an audio signal. My guitar is plugged into input 1. Okay, so I have input 1 say here. So when I play, you should be able to see and hear the sound. Right, you should see it on the meter and you should be able to hear it coming through. So for this song, right, I'm playing something like, right, that does not sound good at all. All right, but let's add the overdrive to get a little bit of that warmth. And you might not actually hear the difference that makes, but you will later. Just know that it adds a little bit of warmth, and that's something that you want to carry through the signal chain, okay? Then the next thing is you want some kind of tube amp. You want some kind of amp simulator. There's these Lepoux amps that people have been using, and one that I found, I'd say 5 years ago, that is still holding true and strong today, and it's free, is STL Tone's Ignite Emissary. Okay, so let me add that. Now you're going to hear a little bit of hiss, and this is basically like emulating if you were plugging into a guitar amp right next to you. You're going to hear some kind of hiss because of the distortion that's going through. But this is basically emulating a tube amp. You could actually dial in these tones, and if you download this and you get this bundle that they deliver it as now, you have a number of presets that you can work with too. All right, so they give you 6 presets, and they also give you 6 IRs, which are impulse responses. Again, we'll talk to that in a little bit. But this will add a good amount of grit to your tone. So let's take a listen. Now that sounds heavily distorted, but it also sounds like crap. So we're not going to leave it there, but we're going to use impulse responses to kind of drive the main sound, the main tone of our guitar. I'll keep everything here just as it is. Just make sure you're on the distorted, not the clean channel. And then let's move on to the next one. Okay, so after you have the amp, now this is an optional step, and I actually see some people putting this on before the amplifier, but it's really something that you want to place right before it goes into the cabinets. So if we're going into a digital space, that would be right before the impulse response cabinets and after the amplifier. So we're going to make that third, but this is a power amp. So the power amp will provide additional level if you need it to, but it really provides additional saturation and warmth to the signal in a pleasing but relatively subtle way. Okay, so I'm going to click that. Let's open it up real quick so you can see what it looks like. Not too many knobs and buttons, which is great. You can alter the depth, presence, and the volume is always if you want to increase the level, but I find that right in the middle of the road is kind of a happy medium for me. I've adjusted it to, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. This is fine for me, especially because, again, the impulse response is going to drive the sound. Okay, so far we have an overdrive pedal that we've kind of kept on the default settings. We have a tube amp emulator that we've kept on the settings, on the default settings. And we have a power amp that we've kept on the default settings. So let's take a listen to what those sound like all together. All right, so you're not hearing a significant difference between 2 and 3, except that you might hear a little bit more saturation, a little bit additional harmonic content that's adding to the pleasant sounds of the distortion that we're hearing coming in from the guitar. That's all great, but we cannot leave it there because it still sounds terrible unless we're actually dialing in the individual knobs on all of these plugins to make a good sound. But what really drives everything, and this is the secret sauce, is the impulse responses. So impulse responses are essentially somebody's plugging in a certain physical equipment like guitar into a head that goes into a cabinet, and they're recording tones across a broad frequency spectrum. Okay, and what happens with those impulse responses is that you can load those in digitally into a piece of software, such as this plugin that I'm about to show you, and it basically has that entire frequency spectrum as if you were playing your sounds through whatever amp and cabinet that somebody else had recorded those frequency spectrums through. So if I want a specific head and cabinet sound into a specific microphone, there might be an impulse response for that. And there are plenty of impulse responses out there that sound exceptionally good. And this is the first time that I thought that digital software could make electric guitars sound just as good, possibly even better, than using analog recording the amplifiers of an electric guitar using a microphone. Okay, this is the first time that it opened my eyes because I've tried a bunch of amp sim softwares in the past and thought this is too good to be true, and most of them ended up being too good to be true. They sounded better on paper than they actually were, using your ears. But with the impulse responses, you start loading those into your VST that will use the impulse responses and play through it, and it sounds almost identical. It's not going to be the same exact thing as if you were miking your analog equipment, right? But it's going to sound very close. So let me put on the impulse response plugin here. And then this is really the heart that's going to shape the tone. If anything, the most important piece of this is loading a specific impulse response. So I have the Ignite, or it's now STL Tones, but the Ignite Amps NAT-IR. So this is the impulse response cabinet loader that comes from Ignite Amps, the same ones that do the tube amplifier that we had put on earlier, as well as the power amp. So all of these things come free. I'll put the links in the description below, of course, so that you have them. What's going on here is I'm loading impulse responses that I've found across the internet, that I've tried out and I've used, and I think sound really close to a tone that I'm looking for. All right, and a couple of them are the Bogren. There's the God cabs, which I'll also put a link to, and then the Telos, but we'll go into that. And I actually have all three of them set up on different tracks, so you can hear the difference. But what would happen is when you open this up for the first time, you have a few impulse responses that come from Ignite Amps, assuming that you're using this impulse response loader, right? But you can click this folder here. You can navigate to where your impulse responses exist. So for me, I have a Soundbanks folder on my external drive, impulse responses, and then I have all these impulse responses that I downloaded. So we got the God's cab here, right? The Bogren, but I'll put those again in the description as links that you can get, again, absolutely free, at least as of the time in my knowledge of recording this video, right? So once you find the one that you're looking for, they actually provide significant number of options. So you can actually choose the different types that you're looking for. So I was looking for a rhythm guitar, and here you just have one file. It's a WAV file that'll load that frequency spectrum that was recorded and play as if you were playing through the amplifier that they recorded that frequency spectrum from. Okay, and then others like God's Cab, like you have all these options, right? Different sample rates, you have these Axe effects. If you go even further, you have the different microphones that you can choose from. So the SM57, and then you can go through all these types of things, right? And then the last one I did was the Telos, and I've seen this used in a few different places as well. So you can go through and you can click on one of these WAV files so that when you load that up and you start playing in, it sounds like you're playing through that cabinet amplifier combination. Okay, so we added our impulse response here. We loaded it into the impulse response VST. So let's take a listen to what that sounds like now. And it's going to be absolutely different from everything else we've heard so far. Right, doesn't that sound significantly better? Like, let me take that off again and show you what it was previously. Before, it was just a crunchy mess. And now it actually sounds like a legitimate electric guitar going through a legitimate amplifier. And that signal is relatively level. You don't really need to compress electric guitars, right? Like, even if you're recording using a microphone on an amplifier where you're playing your electric guitar through, you shouldn't really need to compress too much because it's a digital distorted signal, right, that doesn't have a lot of peaks and valleys in the volume. So now the last thing that we have is EQ. And I put the same types of EQ on two different things. And I just want to make you aware of these, especially if you're a Reaper user. So we have Re-EQ, which is REA EQ, a nice parametric EQ, and there's graphical representation of the waveform as well. So this is nice because you can see which frequencies come in too harsh, dial them back. You can see which frequencies are sound pleasant and you want to dial them in a little bit. Most of the time you're probably going to use subtractive EQ, i.e. you're going to dial back some of the tones that are too harsh, right? And that often is anything below, say, 80 to 100 hertz, but you could even go down to 50, 60. It's not going to hurt too much unless there's something really blazing in these sub-frequencies. And then you're going to want to also kind of cut off a little bit over the high end, right? You want to get those high end frequencies. You don't want it to go too high and too far beyond because that's additional information that clouds up the space with other instruments or say vocals, for example. And then with any electric guitar, there's going to be certain frequencies you want to dial back a little bit, right? There's the low mids where you might have some muffling going on that you want to dial back. There's the mids to upper mids that you might be doing some kind of palm muting, or you might be doing some kind of technique where you hear unpleasant frequencies that you need to dial out a little bit. I find that with my guitar and the signal chain that I'm using and the impulse responses that I'm using going through this entire chain, I find it's a little too prominent in the mids. It almost sounds a little artificial for what I like. So I dialed those back a little bit right here around the 1K range. All right, and I did the same thing for the re-EQ, which is just RE-EQ. To me, it's very similar to re-EQ with the REA EQ, but a lot prettier, right? And it looks a lot like the FabFilter Pro EQ, I should say. So again, if we put the recording on, you should be able to see the waveforms. And again, a parametric equalizer, so you can go and dial in all these different frequencies, dial them in, dial them out, whatever you need to do. Okay, so now we have our EQ, so let's take a listen. Basically not too different, right? It's just a little bit of EQ on top of what we already had going. Not too much different. We just cut out the lows, we cut out the highs, and we just dipped a little bit around 1K. Okay, and I think we dipped a little bit down here in the low mids as well because something was sounding a little too, let's say, boxy. Okay, but that frequency you can actually see. Let me show you real quick here. You can actually see that frequency bouncing up above the other low mids. Okay, so if you saw around here, there were some frequencies that spiked higher than the ones around it. That happened to be the same area that I thought needed a little bit of a cut, which kind of makes sense. Okay, so we dialed all those things in. The best thing about impulse responses is there are an endless amount of impulse responses. That's also the worst thing about it because you could spend all day, every day trying new impulse responses and trying to figure out which ones are the best sound for you. The thing you want to keep in mind, does it serve the purpose of the sound that you're going for the song that you're working in? And there are a lot of free ones that do that. We've been using the Bogren rhythm, all right, the Bogren rhythm impulse response. Let's hear what it sounds like with the God's Cab, right? So a little more hollow, a little less in the low frequencies, a little bit more maybe in like the mid frequencies, but still a good sounding tone overall. And then we also have the telos. Okay, so that definitely takes more of the lower frequencies, or the low mids, I should say, than the God's Cab. So let's listen to the three of them. Again, I'm going to go through and cycle through the differences. Okay, and that's really up to personal preference and also how it sounds with the mix. I would say that I prefer either the first or the third, as awesome as God's Cab is, at least for the application of the song that I'm working with right now. But one other thing I want to show you before we conclude this video. So I told you that this impulse response plugin is the most important piece of this chain. Well, you can't have this without the tube amp or without some kind of amp sim. Right, so if I took out the amp simulator, all right, let's take out the amp simulator, and this is what it'll sound like. Right, it sounds just as if you didn't put anything on this to begin with. Okay, so you need the amp simulator to work with the impulse response loader. Okay, that's the first thing. Now the other thing is, let's keep both those things on, but we'll take out the overdrive, we'll take out the power amp, and we'll take out the EQ so you can hear the subtle differences and the subtle benefits that you have from adding those things on to begin with. Again, taking this version, let's listen to it with all of the plugins on. Okay, taking out the EQ. Maybe a little bit more overbearing on the top end, a little more boxy on the lower end. Right, and the palm mutes are a little overbearing, right, without the EQ kind of taming those down. So to me, it definitely sounds better with the EQ on, but let's put that back on. Let's take off the power amp, okay? Sounds pretty good even without the power amp, but let's put it back on and see what that subtle amount of saturation does to the sound. To me, it brings the guitars a little bit more to life, right? A little bit more presence, a little bit more in the mids, and just a more pleasing sound overall. I know it's very subtle. And then the last thing I want to show is the overdrive. We'll play it with and without the overdrive. So with, without, there's some sort of realness that I feel when I have the overdrive on that I don't feel when I take it off. When I take it off, even if you listen, when you have a guitar, an electric guitar plugged into an amp, and you turn the level up, but you don't play anything yet, you kind of hear this hiss, right? And it's because you're feeding a lot of distortion. There's a lot of, you probably have the volume up high enough where you're going to hear that distortion. And when I have the TS999 on there, the overdrive pedal plugin on there, you can kind of hear that hiss before I start playing. Once you take it off, the hiss goes away completely. And you would think that that's a good thing, but in actuality, that overdrive is emulating something to me that sounds real, right? That hiss is actually a real thing when I'm playing an electric guitar through an amp. So in order of importance here, we have we can't do anything without a tube amp. So you get the tube amp, you could dial in the tube amp and you might be done, right? But then if you add the impulse responses, those really drive the tone more than anything else. So if you have the tube amp and you add an impulse response, you can emulate, similar guitar sounds or guitar cab head combination sounds that you've been admiring. You could probably find a free impulse response that you can load up here and emulate that right in the software. And then you're golden. But if you want a little bit more overdrive, right, add an overdrive pedal, but do that at the beginning of the chain. And if you want a little bit more saturation, then add saturation to the tube amp prior to hitting the cabinets. Okay, so that's where this comes in, right after the amp, but right before the cabinets or the impulse responses. And then EQ to taste, if necessary. Again, compression shouldn't be necessary at this level. If there's something going on with the signal where you're recording an electric guitar and it's all over the place, you need to re-record the electric guitar. If you're going to work with doubles, then use the same signal chain on the doubles and pan them hard left and hard right. Right, if you're going to quad track, I would highly recommend that you change some of the frequencies or the tones of those sounds using the EQ, a parametric EQ, so that the ones panned extremely hard left and right are, either brighter or darker than the ones that are panned like 50-50 left and right. Right, find ways to make them sound a little bit different. You could even use different impulse responses, right? Different cabinet combinations to get that different tone. Because if you're quad tracking, you don't want to record the same thing with the exact same signal chain and putting it in all different areas of the spectrum, right? The left and right, your pan spectrum. You want to make sure that things sound different. The same thing goes true for any melodic instrument. For vocals even, backing vocals do not get the same treatment that the main vocals get. Otherwise, they'll step on each other's toes. Don't do that with electric guitars either. And then what I would do from here is I would group all my electric guitars, the ones panned hard left and right, the ones panned mid left and right, send them to a bus, do a little additional processing, right, before they hit the master. Maybe put a little additional EQ to cut out the highs and lows just a little bit more, maybe dial back some frequency that's a little too harsh after we've combined all 4 of our quad tracks, for example. And then I would add my effects plugins. So reverb and delay, but again, that's all to taste for the song that you're working in. So that's no longer dialing in the tone, but actually dialing in the sound and the effects of the guitars in the reference of the mix so that it sounds good and interesting. I really hope this video helped you to dial in a good guitar tone with the 3 impulse responses and the plugin chains that I showed you with all of the free VSTs, again, third-party free VSTs except for the re-EQ. You can get a really good sounding guitar tone for $0, or at least the cost of your DAW plus free third-party plugins.